Hello, friends. Today, I want to tell you about a rather interesting and unusual scheme that can surprise even the most experienced people in this field. Fraudsters, as always, are not standing still and have reached an entirely new level. The damage from their actions is estimated at tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And to deceive a person for such an amount, it's not necessary for them to actually have that sum. In fact, it's much simpler. It's enough to catch the right moment and offer your cleverly designed scheme at just the right time. This is a completely real story that I want to share with you. Of course, it's not over yet, and events continue to unfold. However, like most such stories, it sparks interest and shows just how intricately schemes can be constructed. To avoid harming the investigation, we will change some names and details. The story takes place in a large, well-known city, let's say London. There is a company we'll call Cargo X Ltd. This company is involved in freight transportation and owns 5 trucks and 5 trailers, all leased. But with each passing year, the company's situation worsened and debts kept piling up. By the end of 2024, the debt load had reached around $70,000. The company's CEO, let's call her Emily, decided that it was time to shut down the business and sell the equipment by transferring the lease. After the sale, she planned to liquidate the company. She put the equipment up for sale, and advertisements appeared online. A few days later, a young man responded to her offer, who will be referred to in this story as Jason. Jason was from another city, but Jason thought that Emily's equipment was exactly what he needed. They agreed that Jason would come to London to review the documents and inspect the equipment. Jason arrived, checked everything, the lease agreements, payment schedules, figured out how much more needed to be paid and what the remaining percentage was. Of course, he also inspected the condition of the equipment and apparently was satisfied. After the inspection, Jason told Emily, "Listen, I'm ready to buy your equipment, but let's start with a small deposit so you can take the ad down. Let's make it $5,000. I'll transfer it to your card, and you can remove the ad from the internet." Emily agreed, the money was transferred, and the ad was taken down. Jason said he needed a little time to discuss the details with his colleagues, choose a company to transfer the lease, and prepare the documents. They agreed to meet again in London in a week to finalize everything. Exactly as planned, the agreed period passed, and Jason flew back to London to meet with Emily. However, the conversation took a turn that Emily hadn't expected. Jason said, "Emily, to be honest, I don't understand how such equipment could lead to losses. I spoke with my partners, we looked at the market. There are a huge number of potential clients in your region, and you've gotten stuck here. If you had expanded the business, things could have been completely different. It's strange to me that a company like yours could even face losses." Emily replied, "Yes, we don't know how this happened. Maybe management failed somewhere, maybe we underestimated our capabilities, but it is what it is." Jason continued, now more confidently, "See, Emily, everything could have been done differently. You've got excellent equipment, you have everything to scale up. I'm sure that if you expand into other regions and start working with other companies, it'll definitely bring in profits." Emily thought for a moment. Finally, she said, "Well, tell me, what's your interest here? What's the deal amount, and how will we close this?" Jason immediately replied, "It's very simple. The deal amount will be $70,000. I'll pay off the lease, and you won't need to worry about liquidating the company anymore. We'll sort out all the tax issues, bankruptcy, and everything else. You just transfer the company to me, and I'll relaunch it. I'll give it a second chance and turn it into a profitable business." Emily thought it over, but in the end, she agreed. "Okay, this seems like a good option. I agree." Jason requested the charter documents, contracts with partners, and the accounting records, everything his lawyers would need to prepare the documents for the lease transfer and company handover. After that, Jason returned to his city And a few days later, he sent Emily packages with contracts that confirmed he was transferring the money. He explained that for legal entities, it's necessary to show where the funds are coming from to avoid problems. As a result, money was transferred from several companies to Emily's company account to pay off the lease debt. When the total amount of $70,000 was collected, Jason instructed Emily to pay off the debt to the leasing company, and she did so. Payment documents were sent to Jason. Emily said, "The debt is cleared. We can move on to transferring the company." Jason confirmed, "Great, the debt is cleared, everything is clear, but now we have a new question. Who will be the CEO? Will I be the founder or will someone else?" He added, "I work on many projects and I have a network of companies operating in different sectors, but before we start the paperwork, we need to get the equipment working, or else the losses will start again. I found a company in another region that's ready to use your equipment." Without hesitation, Emily signed all the necessary documents, and a few days later, specially trained people arrived, loaded the equipment, and sent it off for work. The equipment started operating in a quarry, and as Jason had predicted, Emily began to see her losses disappearing. A little more time passed, and Jason returned with new proposals. He told Emily that he had found a few more companies willing to work with him. However, to finalize all the contracts, he needed to take on even more equipment through leasing, this time 20 tractors. He sent all the necessary contracts and leasing applications that Emily had to forward to several leasing companies. As before, Emily signed everything, and out of 20 applications, 7 tractors Belarus were approved. They agreed that the equipment would be issued in one of the southern regions to be sent directly to construction sites. Emily issued powers of attorney to people who would handle the receipt and registration of the equipment, and everything, just like last time, went smoothly. The 7 tractors were sent to work in the southern part of the country. But then Jason found new opportunities again. He told Emily that he had another project in his network, agricultural work. For this, he needed more machines. He sent contracts with several clients and asked Emily to sign them. As usual, Emily signed the documents without second thinking, and just a few days later, they received applications for 9 new vehicles. This time, they weren't tractors, but cars for agricultural work. Emily signed the necessary papers again, and they sent the requests to leasing companies. As smooth as ever, all 9 car applications were approved. Then, Jason added another truck to the list, which he needed for construction. The vehicles were supposed to be issued in one of the southern regions, while the truck was to be issued in a neighboring area. Jason slipped in a couple more great offers, and Emily easily continued to sign everything without question. Within just a few weeks, all the new vehicles and equipment were already in operation. The agricultural contracts were signed, construction work was underway, and Jason's company was steadily expanding. Meanwhile, Emily, it seems, didn't realize how her company, with no visible signs, was turning into a pile of debts and empty promises. However, just as Emily was about to wrap things up and they had agreed to meet for the official handover of the company, the situation started to change. The day arrived when Emily decided it was time to finish this story and transfer the company to Jason. Everything was going smoothly. The equipment was working, contracts were signed, but the question of transferring the company couldn't be ignored. They had agreed to meet to officially finalize everything and sign the document. But then, things took an interesting turn. Jason suddenly said, "Emily, there's a small problem. Of course, I'm very happy with our cooperation, but there have been some difficulties with the leasing companies, particularly with the payments." Emily immediately became suspicious upon hearing this. "What, again? Something wrong with the payments?" she asked. Jason smiled and replied, "Don't worry, it's all solvable, but could you help speed up the process?" At this point, Emily still didn't understand what he was getting at. Suddenly, she started receiving calls from various leasing companies asking about overdue payments for the equipment that was already in use. "Emily, why haven't we received any payments for the leasing? We see the equipment is working, but for some reason the payments aren't going through. Can you explain this to us?" Emily tried to figure out what was happening and told Jason they urgently needed to resolve the issue. She called the leasing company and passed Jason's contact on to them. Jason assured her everything was under control. "Don't worry, I'll sort it out," he said. But the situation continued to escalate. A few days later, she received another call. "Why are the GPS trackers for the Neva showing one geolocation, but the cars are actually somewhere else?" Anastasia, still not understanding the full picture, responded that she didn't have the exact information and that those questions should be directed to Jason. The leasing company responded, "We don't know any Jason, but we do know that your vehicles are not at the place of work. They're in another region." Emily called Jason. "What's going on? Why are there all these issues with the cars?" Jason reassured her that it was some sort of mistake and that the payment problems were just a misunderstanding. He said it would all be resolved and that there's no need to worry. The equipment was working and everything would be fine. But, as it turned out, that was just the beginning of the surprises. The leasing company announced they would send a team to inspect the equipment. And that's when it was discovered that nearly half of the equipment that Jason had reorganized had disappeared. The leasing employee started asking, "How is this possible? Where is our equipment?" And on the GPS screen, it appeared that the vehicles were in completely different locations. The equipment had vanished from radar, and all that remained were the traces of beacons that had been dismantled. The leasing company, naturally, was in shock. They took the matter seriously and sent their security service. They arrived to check the equipment's location. And what did they find? Seriously, instead of tractors and vehicles, there were empty parking lots. Where the vehicles should have been, there were only traces left by the beacons, which had been removed and disabled. The beacons were attached to batteries, and now they were silent, only showing the places where the equipment had once been. But that's not all. Around the same time, the second leasing company, which had previously helped settle the debt, decided to double-check their equipment just in case. And guess what? They also couldn't find it where it should have been. Everything pointed to the equipment being transferred to completely different areas, and there, who knew where it had gone? Empty spaces. How did all this happen? Very simply, Jason decided to make a bold move. All these deals and shell companies he set up to redistribute the equipment worked like a well-oiled machine. The scheme was designed so that the equipment would be moved and hidden while the money continued to flow into the accounts. Everything was arranged in such a way that all the traces pointed to people who couldn't find their equipment. When the leasing companies began calling Emily and asking, "Where is our equipment? Why don't we know anything?" she felt a growing sense of fear. Just as she decided to file a police report, Jason already knew that her plan was falling apart. Even before Emily told him, he was aware of what was happening and had prepared his next move. After the police report was filed, the real hunt began. Emily began receiving threats, not just to her, but also to her family. While this might seem like a typical situation in criminal schemes, when the threats extend to children, it becomes something much more terrifying. Emily had to hide her child, fearing for their safety. This continued for several months until the investigation entered an active phase. Despite all the threats, Emily decided not to give up. She began gathering information. Over time, she was able to track down several other companies across the country that had fallen victim to similar schemes. They were the same companies, the same people, and of course, the same Jason. That's when she realized that Jason wasn't working alone. His scheme didn't just involve her company. When Emily submitted all the gathered materials to the prosecution's office, the case took a serious turn. The prosecution's office took personal control of the situation, and it was soon revealed that 15 other reports had been filed across the country involving similar schemes, all of which somehow linked back to Jason and his show companies. As Emily continued working with the prosecution's office, the case started gaining momentum. She couldn't help but notice that everything was finally moving in the right direction. Complaints, investigations, documents, all were in her hands. Now that the police and prosecution's office were involved, Jason couldn't hide so easily. The case was heating up, and Emily was confident that soon the criminals would face the punishment they deserved. The process moved forward, and surprisingly, everything began to unravel towards the truth. Emily felt every day that she was getting closer to unraveling how Jason had orchestrated this massive scam. She kept passing new evidence to the prosecution's office as it came to light. And oddly enough, after several months, the case reached its peak. The police began taking action, and Jason could feel the ground slipping beneath his feet. Police across the country began acting on the materials from the reports. And just when enough data had been collected, the case took a new turn. It turned out that Jason wasn't the only one. He was part of a larger network of criminals operating across the country, covering several major cities. It also came to light that his methods were not limited to leasing deals, but had spread to other areas of business. All those companies Jason used to move the equipment were actually shells, controlled by him and his colleagues. They used these companies as cover to legalize their actions and funnel money through fake channels. Everything was so meticulously planned that almost no one could have guessed the scale of the operation. But now the police were untangling this web, and Jason couldn't escape responsibility. While Emily continued to assist the investigation, she began receiving encouraging news. Under pressure, several members of the scheme started giving testimony. They didn't want to lose their freedom, so they decided to cooperate with law enforcement. This was a crucial moment. Soon, Jason was found on the list of prime suspects. He was arrested, and the search began for the rest of the members of his network. But there was still the question: how would this all end? How many people had suffered because of these schemes? And how much money had been lost while Jason continued to play with other people's lives? The case grew so high profile that it caught the attention of not just local media, but international outlets. The story gained traction, and Emily realized that her efforts hadn't been in vain. But of course, much remained to be done to trace all the channels through which the money had flowed. While the police continued their investigation, Emily began to think about what to do next in the situation. The prosecution's office promised to support her at every step, and it seemed like the case was becoming personal for the entire law enforcement system. Emily was promised compensation for her losses and assistance, but she still felt uneasy. The thought kept lingering in her mind. What if Jason manages to worm his way out, as he always does, and gets away with it? But her courage and determination wouldn't let her doubt. This wasn't just about money. It was a matter of honor. When the investigation gained full momentum, it became clear that Jason was not just the man behind the scenes, he was the mastermind of the entire scheme. Everything that had happened was carefully planned and executed. He used dozens of companies to disguise his activities, creating a facade of legitimacy. And although his arrest was a significant step forward, there were still questions that needed to be answered. Naturally, Jason didn't just sit idly by. He continued trying to manipulate the situation even while under investigation. But now it was much more difficult for him, and his chances of getting away scot-free were dwindling. He attempted to hide behind legal loopholes, claiming that all his actions were accidental or misunderstandings. However, the prosecution's office was prepared to prove that this was a systemic scam with a carefully devised plan. Despite all the threats, Emily didn't stop fighting. She knew that this wasn't just about personal revenge on Jason, but also about fighting for justice. Every day she felt her confidence growing, and she was getting closer to the moment when she would see Jason in court. That moment felt so long awaited, and she couldn't let him escape responsibility. Meanwhile, arrests began for other participants in the scheme. Several individuals involved in the criminal circle began cooperating with the authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony was key to uncovering all the details of the scheme and creating an even stronger case against Jason. This was a turning point. The police and prosecutor's office had done a monumental amount of work, and more evidence pointed to the scale of the fraud. Jason was implicated in dozens of leasing companies, as well as many fraudulent transactions. He laundered money, hid traces, used straw men to sign documents, and created fake contracts. Everything he did was aimed at one goal: enriching himself at others' expense. Soon, the investigation revealed that the scale of his actions was much larger than initially thought. Jason and his colleagues had used additional fake companies to reroute leasing payments and conceal their profits. This was a major financial crime with international ties. When the case reached court, the atmosphere was tense. Jason sat in the courtroom with a cold stare, trying not to show that he was scared. But Emily could feel her confidence growing. She knew he could no longer manipulate the situation, and now all the cards were on her side. The trial began, and every move Jason made wasn't just an attempt to defend himself, it was proof of his guilt. No matter how hard he tried to twist the facts, all the evidence pointed to him. Emily felt that this moment was not just her victory, but a triumph over the system of deception and injustice that had existed for so long. Her participation in the process had been decisive. The trial lasted several weeks. Emily watched as Jason's confidence slowly crumbled. He tried to defend himself with unconvincing excuses, but his attempts to delay the process and confuse the investigation became more transparent with each passing day. The entire scheme he had built was finally exposed, and even his lawyer couldn't find any logical arguments to justify their client. More and more of Jason's former partners began coming forward, providing testimonies that completely shattered his defense. It became clear from their statements that Jason had used shell companies and fake contracts to launder money and conceal the true scale of his fraud. His scheme had been so well thought out that many people probably didn't even realize they were part of a criminal enterprise. But no matter how he tried to squirm out of it, the investigation had enough evidence. After several months of legal proceedings, a verdict was reached. Jason was found guilty of large-scale financial fraud and sentenced to a long prison term. He couldn't escape punishment for his crimes, which had cost companies millions of dollars. When the verdict was announced, Emily felt a sense of relief. She had been worried, doubts swirling in her mind, but now she knew that she had done the right thing. This process became not only personal revenge, but also a victory over a system that allowed people like Jason to ruin honest entrepreneurs for their own gain. The trial became a significant milestone in her life. She understood that while Jason might be in prison, his criminal network could still try to operate. But Emily was no longer afraid. Everything she had endured had strengthened her, and now she was ready to fight for justice until the end. With the help of the prosecutor's office, she received compensation for her losses, and even an opportunity to work with the authorities to prevent similar schemes in the future. But most importantly, she learned that justice must be fought for. And despite all the difficulties, she proved that criminals could and must be fought, even when they seemed unbeatable.